Alaska, the country's largest state, landmass encompassing more than half of the continental U.S. There are so many areas to just get lost in. Today we're going to talk about a Cessna 310 that not only had a crew, but a prominent politician on board that over 50 years has not been seen since. Alaska's rugged terrain, untamed wilderness, and extreme weather conditions pose unique challenges for any aviator. So let's embark on this journey together as we navigate the twists and turns of this unfolding story that spans over 50 years. Welcome to Destination Aviation. Well, welcome back, fellow aviators and aviation enthusiasts, to the podcast. I know last week I had asked if everybody had a good time at Oshkosh. I had not seen the news of the accident between the two rotorcraft. Condolences to those aviators and their families. Hopefully, though, everybody else was able to make it home safe and sound as we are moving into August and into the end of summer here. So as you heard from the intro, we're going to the state of Alaska today. Representative Don Young, who's a Republican from Alaska, passed away last year as he was actually traveling home. So I had a bit of an aviation story just to begin with, but something I would have been paying attention to. And really the articles were, longest serving U.S. representative dies. Don Young had been serving since 1973. But as I started reading into the story and how he was elected, it's really what led me to today's podcast because it's so fascinating. For myself, my biggest exposure to Alaska has been Northern Exposure, the TV show, which I'm dating myself, which took place in Alaska. Probably some of those early memories of flying, right? Maggie had her plane going in and out of Alaska, Sicily, Alaska, if I remember correctly. Ironically, you can't even find that show too much these days. There's this whole weird thing with the copyrights to the beginning music where we saw the moose going through town. And so for it to be in syndication, a lot of people basically have just forgotten about the show. And people in my life know that I tend to have on, as I do right now, as I'm doing this podcast in the background, Brook Falls, which is in Alaska. It's in a national park, and they have live cam streaming of the grizzly bears catching salmon. And I think I'm probably, well, I'm not the only one who finds it fascinating because there's 2,000 people watching right now as I speak. But those 2,000 people are probably similar to me. People will say, what are you watching fish for? It's, to me, though, fascinating how they sit on the edge. Some of them have different techniques. One's on the top. Others like to swim and snag the fish with their paws. It's just amazing to me to see the scenario that they have set up for themselves there. But I have not flown in Alaska. Obviously, I read a lot of flying magazines. I see a lot of the trips people make up there. When you read the regulations, basically everything seems to be out the window. If you're that last caveat line, right? Oh, you can't fly with an axe unless you're in Alaska, or whatever it might be. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration there. So how did I come to find out about Don Young? Well, a lot of my job is dealing with legislators. Airports in particular are funded through what is known as Airport Improvement Program. Typically, it's funds that are generated within the system. And so every year, there are funds that are distributed to airports based on where they are in the national plan of integrated airport system. And so entitlement dollars, discretionary dollars. For years, there were what was referred to as earmark dollars. Those went away. They are back in another form called community-funded projects. What happens here typically is a representative of your area can request a certain amount of funds be directed to certain projects, in this case in aviation, to airports or to infrastructure at airports or things to do within the aviation sectors. It could make sense, right, that your representatives, especially than your senators, would know your area better than anyone else. So the idea is not bad. As most things in life, some people take advantage of this. So you had heard me mention, for a while we had earmarks, and then for a long time we had nothing. More recently, community-funded projects have returned. The reason why there was that gap is there was the Bridge to Nowhere. It was a term that gained prominence in the mid-2000s, and it refers to a proposed infrastructure project in Alaska by Representative Don Young. The bridge was intended to connect a small town of Ketchikan, Alaska, to Granite Island, where Ketchikan International Airport is located. The project was championed by the late U.S. Representative Don Young, who was serving as the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee at the time. The original intention behind the bridge was to provide better transportation access for the residents of Grevana Island and the airport. However, the project received significant attention and criticism because of its hefty price tag and the relatively low population of the area it was supposed to serve. The estimated cost of the bridge was around $398 million. Critics argue that the project was an example of wasteful government spending, as it was disproportionately benefit a small number of people at the exorbitant cost of taxpayers. The proposed bridge became a symbol of earmarks, which are special provisions or projects that are added to spending bills without undergoing the usual scrutiny of a regular budget process. Due to public outlash, the mounting criticism, the Bridge to Nowhere project was ultimately canceled in 2007. The funds that were originally allocated to the bridge were redirected to other transportation projects in Alaska. The Bridge to Nowhere has since become a widely known example of controversial government spending proposal, and it has sparked discussions about the need for fiscal responsibility and transparency in government-funded projects. These type of funds can make a lot of sense. It depends more on the people that are administering the funds and if they're going to have an actual impact for the greater good. However, Young's own admission, he would have never been representative if his rival, Nick Begich, didn't go missing in the vast Alaska wilderness while campaigning on a Cessna 310. So who was Representative Begich? Well, he was born in Minnesota and moved to Anchorage, Alaska to work as a guidance counselor. In 1968, Begich ran for Alaska's only House seat. House seats, as we know, are based off of population. Every state gets 2 U.S. senators, and then every state gets a representative based off of population. When Begich ran in 1968, he lost to the incumbent representative, who was a Republican, Howard Pollock. In 1978, Pollock ran for governor of Alaska, and Begich ran for his seat and was successful by defeating Republican banker Frank Morawski, who later served as U.S. Senator and then governor of Alaska. In 1972, for re-election, Begich was opposed by Republican State Senator Don Young. Posthumously, Begich won the 1972 election with 56% to Don Young's 44%. However, Begich was declared dead in a special election. Young won the seat and retained it until his own death in March 18th of 2022. So even in death, Begich won the seat against Representative Don Young, and just by him being declared dead was the only way Don Young was able to win the seat for Alaska. However, Don Young did keep that seat until his death over 50 years later. So let's talk a little bit about the accident. The aircraft was a Cessna 310 C model. The Cessna 310, I actually worked a lot with this aircraft. The first airport I worked at, the airport manager, he would fly charter around Lake Michigan, mostly down to Chicago and back up to Manistee, Michigan. This tail number was 1812 Hotel, in addition to the pilot, 3 passengers, including 2 U.S. congressmen. If you think about this accident in today's standards, with there being 2 representatives on there, one of them was the House Majority Leader. So it would be the same as Kevin McCarthy going down in an aircraft today with a newer representative, as he was campaigning with them. Obviously, that would be huge news, especially if they were missing. So Representative Hale Boggs was the House Majority Leader. He became the House Majority Leader in 1971. On October 16, 1972, both Nick Begich and House Majority Leader Hale Boggs of Louisiana were 2 of the 4 men aboard an engine Cessna 310 that disappeared during a flight from Anchorage to Juneau. So they're departing Anchorage and they're going to Juneau. Also on board the plane were Begich's aide Russell Brown and pilot Don Jans. This trip was meant to be a campaign fundraiser for Begich. An enormous search effort, obviously, right? You have not only one U.S. representative, but a second U.S. representative that is the House Majority Leader, would invoke a huge, massive search and rescue. Predominantly, this was Coast Guard, Navy, Army, Air Force, and Civil Air Patrol. Plus, civilians were deployed to look for the 4 men and the missing Cessna 310. On November 24th, 1972, after proceeding for 39 days, the air search was suspended. Neither the airplane nor any of its 4 occupants were ever found. All were declared dead on December 29th, 1972. The Cessna was required to carry an ELT, or Emergency Locator Transmitter, per Alaska state statute, which took effect September 6th of 1972, 5 weeks before the plane disappeared. The Alaska statute, of course, made reference to the Federal Aviation Regulation 9152, published on September 21st, 1971, which mandated ELTs in aircraft such as this. The effective date, though, was December 30th of 1973 for this existing aircraft. However, no ELT signals were ever picked up from this aircraft. The pilot carried a portable ELT in lieu of a fixed ELT to the aircraft. However, it was noted that the pilot's portable ELT was found in another aircraft in Fairbanks, Alaska. The report notes that a witness saw an unidentified object in the pilot's briefcase that resembled, except for the color, a portable ELT. The NTSB concluded that neither the pilot nor the aircraft had an ELT while traveling. So we're going to go a little bit into here of what the NTSB report says. A Cessna Model 310 Charlie, November 1812 Hotel, operated by the chief pilot of Pan Alaska Airways, departed from Anchorage International Airport, Alaska at 8:59 local time a.m. on October 16, 1972. 3 passengers, included 2 United States congressmen, were aboard. At 1909, the pilot of 1812 Hotel filed a visual flight rules flight plan with the Anchorage Flight Service Station. He stated that he had departed Anchorage at 900 hours and that his intended route of flight was via the V317 airway to Yakutat, then direct to his destination, which was Juneau International Airport. His estimated flight time was 3 hours and 30 minutes. At 13:15, so 1:15 in the afternoon, the U.S. Air Force Rescue Coordination Center at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska received notification that November 1812 Hotel was overdue at Juneau. An extensive search of the area along the proposed route and all probable alternate routes were conducted during the following 5.5 weeks. Nothing was found that could be identified as either the aircraft or its occupants. The weather conditions along the proposed route from Anchorage to Juneau were not conducive for flight under visual flight rules. The National Transportation Safety Board is unable to determine the probable cause of this accident from the evidence presently available. If the aircraft is found, the Safety Board will continue its investigation and make determination as the probable cause of the accident. The Safety Board recommends that the Federal Aviation Administration, through its accident prevention staff, make wide dissemination of the details of the accident to the general aviation community, particularly those pilots and operators involved in operations in remote and environmental hostile areas. Which is right, we all can learn from all accidents. The pilot, according to the report, remained overnight in Anchorage before the flight the day before. At about 7 a.m. in the morning of the flight, the pilot telephoned Anchorage Flight Service and asked for the current weather in Juneau, Sikata, Yakutat, and Cordova weather. He told that flight service station briefer that he would be flying a Cessna 310 under VFR or visual flight rule conditions to Juneau. The FSS briefer gave the pilot the weather conditions that were reported at 0600. The briefer also informed the pilot that the Portage Pass was forecast to be closed. Shortly after 0800, the pilot taxied 1812 Hotel to refueling pits at Sea Aeromotive Inc., a fixed-base operation located at the Anchorage International Airport. For those of you who don't know, fixed-base operators are basically glorified gas stations. In accordance with the pilot's instructions, a Sea Aeromotive employee filled the wingtip tanks with 100 low-lead grade aviation gasoline. A total of 48.7 gallons were put into the aircraft. The Sea Aeromotive employee who saw and heard the aircraft stated that it appeared and sounded normal. Nothing was placed aboard the aircraft except the gasoline. The pilot had returned 1812 Hotel to the parking ramp near the base of the Anchorage Control Tower at about 8:40. 3 passengers boarded the aircraft shortly thereafter. A witness identified those passengers as the Honorable Hale Boggs and the Honorable Nicholas Begich. Both were United States congressmen, one from Louisiana and one from Alaska. Mr. Russell Brown was administrative aide to Congressman Begich, and the witness also stated a small amount of baggage was placed aboard the aircraft. At 8:55, the pilot requested and received from Anchorage ground controller taxi information for a VFR departure from Anchorage. He made the takeoff for runway 24 right at 8:59. The Anchorage Control Tower and ground controllers both stated that the aircraft appeared normal while taxiing during takeoff and departure. The aircraft was approximately 2 miles south of the airport at an estimated altitude of 2,000 feet and on a southeasterly heading when last seen by the local controller. This was the last known observation of November 1812 Hotel. At 9:09, the pilot of 1812 Hotel established radio communications with Anchorage Flight Service Station. It filed a VFR flight plan. The flight service specialist recognized the voice of the pilot as being that of the same person to whom he had given a telephonic weather briefing at 0656 hours. The pilot stated that he had departed from Anchorage at 0900 hours and had an intended route of flight via the V317 airway to Yakutat, then direct to Juneau, a 3 hour and 30 minute true airspeed of 170 knots. He informed the flight service specialist that he had 4 passengers and fuel for 6 hours on board. In response to the specialist's query as to whether he had emergency gear and a locator beacon aboard, the pilot replied, affirmative. This goes back to what we talked about, where the rules had changed and somebody had mentioned that they thought they saw he had a mobile ELT or emergency alerted transmitter, but the NTSB had ruled he probably did not have one at all. The flight service specialist then advised the pilot the Cordova, Yucatec, and Juneau weather as reported at 0900 sequence reports. He also gave the pilot a pertinent portions of the current terminal and area forecast. This was last known communication with anyone on November 1812 hotel. At 1350 hours or 1:15 in the afternoon, the U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center at Juneau informed the U.S. Air Force at Elmendorf Air Force Base that November 1812 hotel was overdue at Juneau. The U.S. Air Force conducted an extended communications check of all airfields and facilities that might have knowledge or whereabouts of November 1812 hotel. At 1345, when this check proved fruitless, the U.S. Air Force diverted 2 aircraft to commence a search for November 1812 hotel. This effort began one of the most extensive searches for missing aircraft that had been conducted up to this point in recent aviation history. The established search areas encompass thousands of square miles. When the search for November 1812 hotel was officially terminated on November 24, 1972, much of the area had been covered numerous times by various types of U.S. Air Force Army, U.S. Coast Guard, Civil Air Patrol, civil aircraft, and helicopters. A total of 3,602 hours of flight time had been flown, covering an area of approximately 325,000 square miles. In addition, the U.S. Coast Guard cutters and merchant marine and fishing vessels conducted extensive searches of Prince William Sound, the Gulf of Alaska, and the Icy Straits areas. Much of the Portage Pass area was also searched twice by ground personnel. Despite the thoroughness of the search, nothing was found that could be identified as November 1812 hotel or its occupants. The mountainous terrain along the V317 airway between Anchorage and Yucatec is such that, weather permitting, pilots of small aircraft proceeding VFR along the route at a general rule fly in the southeasterly direction from Anchorage over the Treganzing arm of the Cook Inlet, through Portage Pass, and over the Prince William Sound to Johnstown Point and on to Yucatec. The lower elevations of the Portage Pass proper are approximately 400 feet MSL, or mean sea level. However, mountains rise steeply on either side of the pass elevations between 3,000 and 6,000 feet MSL. The minimum obstruction clearance altitudes along the 317 over the Portage Pass are 7,100 to 8,000 feet MSL. The October 16, 1972 surface weather chart prepared by the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Anchorage showed, among other phenomenons, a warm front extending eastward from point near Illinois Point to about 50 miles south-southeast of Yucatec. A high-pressure system was centered off the coast of southeastern Alaska. The surface weather conditions, as reported on the 0600 sequence reports, were in part as followed for the stations. Cordova ceiling measured at 2,500 feet broken, 5,000 feet overcast, and a visibility of 7 miles. Yucatec was 300 feet scattered, ceiling measured 700 feet overcast, visibility 1.5 miles in fog. Juneau ceiling indefinite, 500 feet obscured, 1/2 mile fog, and Sikata clear, visibility of 12 miles. We remember from our pilot training that VFR flying in this class of airspace would be 3 Cessna 152s, so 3 miles visibility, 1,000 feet above clouds, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet in between. So at least with some of these reports, it was not a VFR day. The later surface weather observations for the stations at the time indicated were in part as follows. Anchorage, 900 feet to 4,000 feet scattered, with a ceiling estimate of 6,000 feet broken, 8,000 feet overcast with 30 miles of visibility, and a temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a dew point of 37 degrees Fahrenheit, wind 300 at 8 knots. At Seward, it was 1,000 ceiling with estimated 4,000 feet overcast, visibility of 7 miles, and very light drizzle, temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, dew point of 45 degrees, wind of 200 degrees at 28 knots, and gust of 33 knots. Visibility 3 miles in northeast 1/2, corridor 1,000, ceiling measured at 3,500 feet, broken at 5,000 feet overcast, and 7 miles visibility in light rain. generally speaking, the weather conditions were deteriorating as time moved on. So who was Pan Alaska Airways? They were a certified air taxi commercial operator authorized by the Federal Aviation Administration to conduct air carrier operations under Part 135, so charter on demand. Pan Alaska was restricted to the use of aircraft 500 pounds or less of a maximum certified takeoff weight. In addition, Pan Alaska was certified to conduct flight instruction operations at its facilities located in Fairbanks, Alaska. When operating multi-engine aircraft under Part 135 rules, Pan Alaska was restricted to VFR flight unless there were 2 pilots aboard, or the aircraft was equipped with autopilot and the pilot had demonstrated competency to fly the aircraft by use of autopilot under instrument conditions. There was no evidence to establish conclusively if the pilot of 1812 Hotel was being compensated for the flight from Anchorage to Juneau. It was noted that a witness did testify the pilot stated he was not getting paid for the flight. The question of compensation is relevant if Pan Alaska aircraft was not being operated for hire, then the provisions of Part 91 would apply to this flight. If the flight had been operated for hire, it would be 135. As we know, Part 135 is much more restrictive than Part 91 flying, which Part 91 is not for hire. The pilot, though, of this aircraft, he was the chief pilot of Pan Alaska Airways and the president. He had acquired extensive flying experience in Alaska, so he had extensively flown the Alaska terrain. On the last 100-hour inspection of the Cessna 310, there were no discrepancies listed on the aircraft. The aircraft was equipped with VOR navigational receiver, ADF receiver, and a VHF transceiver. It was also equipped with an oxygen system, although the system had not been serviced for oxygen before departure of this flight. The aircraft was not equipped with the automatic pilot, nor was there any anti-icing equipment installed on the aircraft except for a heated pitot tube. The aircraft was also not equipped with an emergency transmitter, nor was one required by the Federal Aviation Administration. However, as we reported before, Alaska law effective on September 6, 1972, prohibited flight unless an aircraft was equipped with an emergency located transmitter. So it's interesting. You don't have de-icing equipment, you don't have oxygen, and you do not have an emergency locator transmitter. Also, back to what they spoke about before, between Part 91 and 135, if under 135 for being paid, it was a requirement as a single pilot to have autopilot, which this aircraft did not. So if they were flying 135, they were in violation of that rule. It was noted that the aircraft was apparently slightly overweight on departure from Anchorage. The National Transportation Safety Board did not believe the extra weight probably had an adverse effect on the flight or the capability of the aircraft to complete the flight as planned. The investigation did not disclose evidence that the pilot's performance or technique of during flight was in any way a contributing factor. It was noted that the pilot was the author of several articles about flying under adverse weather conditions, especially in Alaska. The articles, among other things, advised pilots to prepare for situations that were likely to be encountered. For instance, he advocated that one always maintains a mental picture of the weather ahead, a reserve of altitude, extra fuel, and alternate course of action. He advised against flying into obviously bad situations, such as dark areas of precipitation, when the outside temperature was in a critical icing range. To avoid icing, he recommended remaining in VFR conditions as much as possible and climbing through holes and flying between or on top of clouds rather than into clouds. Further, he recommended that a double check be made on survival equipment aboard the aircraft, that proper winter clothing be worn by all occupants of the aircraft. On the day of the flight, the forecast and existing weather conditions along the significant portion of the proposed route were not conducive to flight and visual conditions. There is ample evidence that the pilot was aware of the poor en route weather conditions, and the available evidence suggests that the disappearance of 1812 Hotel may have been related to those conditions. So the conclusions of the report are: the pilot of 1812 Hotel was certified and qualified in accordance with applicable regulations. The aircraft was certificated in accordance with applicable regulations. It was not equipped with an emergency locator transmitter as required by the state of Alaska at the time. The pilot of 1812 Hotel was not in possession of a portable emergency locator transmitter nor survival equipment when he departed Anchorage. So from his own recommendations to pilots, he did not follow his own rules. Maybe a case of get it there-itis. You have important passengers on the aircraft. They have to get to an area quickly. The weather conditions along the proposed route of flight from Anchorage to Juneau were not conducive for flight under visual flight rules. The probable cause from the NTSB is unable to determine because, kind of like we spoke about in the disappearance over Lake Michigan, you don't have the aircraft, you don't have the passengers, so it's hard to make an assumption of what happened with little evidence. The same as with the aircraft in Lake Michigan. If you go back and listen to our first episode, Missing Over Lake Michigan, if the wreckage were ever to be found, they could probably make further determinations on what happened. Now you're talking 50 years in the Alaska wilderness, but it's possible that maybe the weather conditions have left this aircraft somewhat intact. Now, this report is very old. Obviously, it was printed in 1973. The exhibits in here, I will take shots and post onto our Instagram so you can kind of see the search area along with updated sectionals of the search area for the Cessna 310. So the pilot information, who was Don Jans? He was age 38 and was president and chief pilot and sole stockholder of Pan Alaska Airways. He held an air transport certificate with commercial privileges in airplane multi-engine, land and sea, single-engine land. He also held an airplane instrument flight instructor rating. As of May 31st, 1972, Don had reported to the FAA a total of 17,000 hours of flight time, including 11,900 hours of cross-country time and 10,000 hours of multi-engine time, 1,470 hours of actual instrument time. Don had successfully completed a flight check on the Cessna 310 on August 21st, 1972. By those numbers, he was very accomplished at the age of 38. The aircraft itself had a total time of 3,177 hours, and it had 400 hours on the engine since the last major overhaul. So as in many cases when someone who is powerful, rich, or influential disappears, conspiracy theorists will start going to what exactly maybe happened in a conspiratorial world. The disappearance of Representative Hale Boggs is a historical event that gave rise to various conspiracy theories over the years. Hale Boggs was a powerful Democrat congressman from Louisiana who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1941 to 1973. He also became the House Majority Leader, making him one of the most influential figures in Congress. Remember, the House of Representative leader is third in line for the presidency. So from the president to the vice president, it goes to the leader of the House of Representatives. So you are 3 heartbeats away from being president. On October 16, 1972, Boggs was flying from Anchorage to Juneau, Alaska, along with Representative Nick Begich, an aide, and the pilot. The aircraft vanished en route, and despite an extensive search, no wreckage or survivors were ever found. The official cause of the disappearance was ruled an accident due to adverse weather conditions. However, some conspiracy theories have emerged speculating about alternative explanations for Boggs' disappearance. Given Boggs' prominent position in Congress, some are suggesting that the disappearance may have been politically motivated. It's important to note that Boggs was involved in several controversial issues, including his opposition to the Vietnam War and his support for civil rights legislation. Some believe that powerful interests may have wanted to remove him from the political landscape. Some conspiracy theories propose that there was an assassination of Boggs because of his opposition to the Warren Commission's finding on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Boggs was a member of the Warren Commission, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the assassination of President Kennedy. However, he later expressed doubts about the commission's findings, which might have made him a target. It is important to emphasize that these theories are speculative and lack any concrete evidence. The official investigation and subsequent inquiries concluded that the disappearance was most likely due to adverse weather conditions, and the case remains unsolved. Conspiracy theories often arise in cases where high-profile individuals are involved, and they can capture the public's imagination, but they should be approached with critical thinking and understanding of available evidence. One of the conspiracy theories that I actually saw while I was researching this was that J. Edgar Hoover had played a role in the assassination of Hale Boggs. On April 5th of 1971, Boggs gave a floor speech denouncing the Federal Bureau of Investigation and its powerful director, J. Edgar Hoover. A New York Times report noted he compared the FBI's method to tactics of the Soviet Union and Hitler's Gestapo. Boggs called upon Attorney General John Mitchell to demand Hoover's resignation. Boggs specifically charged the FBI had wiretapped congressional offices and stationed agents on college campus to spy on students. According to media reports, political observers were shocked when Boggs publicly attacked Hoover, long considered the most powerful man in Washington. In a recorded phone call with President Richard Nixon, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, only explanation was that perhaps Boggs was either drinking too much or he had taken some pills that were upsetting him mentally. Ford defended Hoover on the floor, while the Attorney General said Boggs should apologize. Nixon had the Majority Leader removed from high-level meetings and restricted his access to classified information. Now, also consider they were two opposite parties, Nixon being Republican and Boggs being a Democrat. Back in Louisiana, then Governor McKeithen personally called Hoover and assured him that the state government did not share Boggs' views. Boggs doubled down on his charges against Hoover days after his floor speech. He told CBS News the country cannot survive under a man who in declining years has violated the Bill's rights of the understanding. campaigning. While he never backed away from the charges, the controversy eventually ended when Boggs mysteriously disappeared in October 1972 while campaigning for the Democratic congressional candidate in Alaska. Documents classified since Hoover's death have since proven Boggs' accusations against the FBI were in fact true. So that could lead, right, that if there was truth behind it, maybe there was some attempt to try and silence Representative Boggs, but still unfounded. It does make for salacious information, of course. And there are further podcasts out there that do talk more in depth of this. So if you minus off the conspiracy theorists, most of the research I've done into this believe that the plane had icing conditions and bad weather. Probably a case of get it there-itis with very important people on board. The Juneau Empire, interesting enough, the grandson of Representative Boggs, wrote that one of the conspiracy theorists was that the aircraft was bombed by mobsters. Begich's widow briefly married Jerry Palso, who was a convicted murderer. He had noted in prison that mobsters blew up the plane. However, nothing of this nature has ever been substantiated. So more conceivable bad weather is probably what brought down this aircraft. Boggs' grandson is requesting that a more thorough search now be done more than 50 years later for the aircraft, basically stating that there's a strong case the aircraft could be found now through the vast wilderness of Alaska. One example that he points towards is a eyewitness or eye-ear account of hearing the plane over Whittier, Alaska, suggesting that it made its way through the treacherous Portage Pass. The temperature on the ground that day of the crash was approximately 40 degrees, lessening the chances of icing and crashing in the far depths of Prince William Sound. The thought is if the aircraft experienced serious icing, it would have likely had time to contact the next radio point, which is contrary to the NTSB's report of the disappearance. Grandson references the plane had both de-icing and anti-icing equipment. That is contradictory to the NTSB report. So the grandson is stating that if the plane had iced up, it had the technology on board to buy the pilot time, find a place to land. The grandson believes that the aircraft went down quickly after clearing Portage Pass. There's a report that he references in 1980 of a tail of a Cessna airplane matching the colors and description of his grandfather's plane near Hitchinbrook Island at the entrance of Prince William Sound. I could not find a news article to substantiate the 1980 finding of the Cessna aircraft tail, but the grandson points to a smallish area in which the plane is likely to have gone down between Whittier and Hitchinbrook Island. I'll try to plug in as well some of that on a sectional into the Instagram post. Basically, he's referencing that's a 75-mile area. While much of that area is covered by water, he believes with 21st century technology that it's searchable and small enough for a more comprehensive focus than the 600 miles of deep water and rugged mountains between Anchorage and Juneau. So as we go back to the simplest of conclusions, when mysteries abound, conspiracies abound. When we all take off, we assume we'll be back on the ground at our next destination. Very rarely does anybody actually think that they're going to be the ones caught in that instance, or it can't happen to me. Plenty of hours, plenty of flight time. I've personally known people that have had 15, 17,000 hours that make mistakes that even they tell other people not to make, whether that's going against your best judgment in weather, pushing the envelope on having equipment in the aircraft, such as survival equipment, emergency locator transmitters. It sounds like there were several critical steps that were missed in this, probably what would be considered a routine flight. You had people waiting at the destination, especially when you're talking fundraising. You know, one of the interesting things as I was doing research into this podcast, Nick Begich III, unlike his grandfather, is a Republican and is running for the seat that his grandfather once held. Nick Begich III comes from a lineage of people that started with his grandfather, Nick Begich, as a representative. His uncle, Mark Begich, served as the mayor of Anchorage, the state's largest city, and was also a U.S. Senator from 2003 to 2009. His uncle, Tom, also served 2 terms in Alaska State Senate. Nick has recently announced that he is running for representative against Mary Peltola, a Democrat, and is the state's only statewide elected Democrat. Similar to our first podcast, Missing Over Lake Michigan, the Alaska Triangle is referenced. This Cessna 310 disappeared into this area as well. It was reported that over 32,000 disappearances have happened, so that's between, missing people, hikers, aircraft, boats, etc. Another area's triangle. Because of Alaska's size, its rugged terrain, and its often severe weather, which comes up out of nowhere, flying there is a serious endeavor, unforgiving of mistakes. The state covers nearly 663,000 square miles, and if you remember from this search, you were nearly around 340,000 square miles. It has a coastal line of 6,640 miles. It contains North America's tallest mountains, 2 national forests, and over 100,000 glaciers. As we spoke, the weather is fast forming, which creates storms, hazardous icing, and frequently obscures mountains and passes, resulting in a widely varied climate that is often not conducive to flight by visual references. Given all of these factors, disappearances are overwhelming in the landscape, and is just a parcel of the state's reality, even more so an ever-powerful mythology, which for us who are pilots, or for those who want to be pilots, or just enthusiasts, you never take anything for granted. It's easy to say you're the expert. It's easy to write the books, right? It's easy to put an article out and say, do this and follow this. But if we don't follow our own guidance, we could very much find ourselves in a disappearance as well. Flying is not forgiving. It's one of the best things you can do in the world. But if you don't treat it with respect, you may just end up missing. Who knows what exactly happened in this case, but probably the reality of the situation is conspiracy theories abound. It probably wasn't that. It probably was Mother Nature and maybe people that were ambitious to get somewhere. But as with all things in time, as things change, there's been instances recently in Alaska where aircraft wreckages, even from this time frame, have been discovered. So who knows? Maybe we're on the cusp of some breakthrough technology that will discover where this flight happened and give us more clues so we can continue to move forward. Part of the legislation that Alaska enacted, this accident helped push for emergency locator transmitters and aircraft. And today we have things like the Civil Air Patrol, which are out there looking for these when ELTs go off. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone to taking the time to listen to the podcast today. You've probably noticed we updated our artwork on the podcast. We actually had that commissioned, which I think turned out really great. Love the feel of it. I hope you do too. Feel free to drop us a line at our email, which I'll put down in the comments. And until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.